My sister called me at 5:48 on a Thursday morning to say our father had died during the night. He was sitting across from me at the kitchen island, wearing my gray bathrobe, eating scrambled eggs directly from the pan because he said plates created unnecessary work. "Claire," Vanessa whispered, her voice already shaped for sympathy. "Dad's gone. It happened peacefully. Preston and I were with him at the end." My father stopped chewing. I placed the call on speaker and watched his eyebrows rise. Vanessa continued before I could react. "There's something else you need to understand. Dad changed his estate plan in April. He left the house, the marina property, the investment account, everything to me and Preston. You were removed. Please don't make the memorial about money." In the background, her husband Preston said, "Tell her she's not coming into the house." Vanessa lowered her voice as though protecting me from embarrassment. "You moved away, Claire. We were the ones who stayed." Dad finally recognized that. My father set down his fork, leaned toward the phone, and said 6 words in a voice so calm that I felt the air change around us. Vanessa did not hear him because I had already pressed mute. She would hear those words 3 days later, standing inside the old ferry terminal in front of 109 people, with a forged trust amendment in her hand and our father's memorial photograph behind her. By then, she had already ordered flowers, changed the locks on his house, contacted his bank, and scheduled an estate appraisal before anyone had supposedly identified his body. She believed she was preparing to inherit a dead man. What she was actually preparing was the most thoroughly witnessed confession of her life. "My name is Claire Mercer. I was 38 years old when my sister tried to bury our father without checking whether he had stopped breathing. We grew up in Port Haven, Maine, a small coastal town where people measured distance by coves, storms, and which family had owned which stretch of shoreline before anyone thought to call it valuable. Our father, Samuel Mercer, spent 41 years working on ferries. He began as an electrical apprentice, became a marine engineer, and eventually supervised maintenance for the boats carrying commuters and tourists between the islands and the mainland. He could identify an engine problem by vibration through the deck. He could repair navigation lights in freezing rain and drink coffee during weather that made sensible people cancel plans. He was not wealthy in the way Vanessa liked to imagine wealth. He never wore expensive clothes, never replaced a truck before it became structurally offensive, and considered restaurant wine a conspiracy. But he had bought our family's waterfront house in 1987, paid it off early, and later purchased a narrow adjoining parcel with a workshop and 14 small marina slips. What had once been a muddy piece of working shoreline was now worth close to $1.6 million because summer people had discovered that ordinary families had been living beside beautiful water for generations. Dad also had retirement savings, municipal bonds, and the proceeds from selling a marine repair business he had operated on weekends. He lived simply enough that most people assumed he had less than he did. Vanessa's husband did not make that mistake. Preston Vale called himself a property developer, although most of his developments existed longer in computer renderings than in concrete. He wore quilted vests with business shirts, leased vehicles large enough to invade a small country, and described debt as leverage whenever it belonged to him. Vanessa had married him 15 years earlier. At first, he sold luxury renovations around Portland and did well. Then he began purchasing properties before securing permits, borrowing against one project to rescue another, and assuring everyone that the next closing would solve the previous problem. Vanessa managed the office, staged model homes, and defended him with the intensity of a person who had tied her identity to someone else's confidence. I lived in Boston and worked as a hospital discharge coordinator. My job was to help patients and families understand what happened after the physician said they could go home. I arranged rehabilitation, medication access, home nursing, transportation, and safety plans. I had spent years sitting across from adult children who disagreed about what was best for an aging parent. I knew how easily concern became control and how quickly control could wear the face of devotion. What I did not understand was how much harder it would be to recognize when it happened inside my own family. Dad had always been closest to me in temperament. We both liked quiet rooms and direct questions. Vanessa needed people, activity, and proof that she was appreciated. When our mother Elaine developed ovarian cancer, Vanessa moved temporarily into our parents' house and became the visible center of the caregiving operation. She organized meal schedules, posted updates, and knew which church member had brought which casserole. I handled medical appointments, insurance appeals, medication logs, and the late-night calls when Mom was afraid. Neither contribution was imaginary, but after Mom died, Vanessa began telling the story as though she had been the only daughter present. "Some of us rearranged our lives," she said once at Thanksgiving when I mentioned a difficult week at the hospital. I reminded her that I had driven from Boston nearly every weekend for 14 months. "Driving in and out isn't the same as staying," she replied. "Dad told us to stop. He hated conflict because our mother had usually absorbed it before it reached him. Without her, the old differences between us became exposed beams. Vanessa believed proximity entitled her to authority. I believed competence would eventually speak for itself. Both beliefs created the conditions Preston needed. The trouble began in November, when Dad slipped on the dock behind his workshop. He fell between two mooring posts and fractured his left ankle badly enough to require surgery. The injury was painful but not life-threatening. Dad was 76, mentally sharp, and furious that the surgeon would not negotiate the length of his recovery. I drove up the same afternoon and spent 2 nights at the hospital. Vanessa arrived with Preston the morning after surgery carrying a notebook, an overnight bag, and the expression of a woman prepared to assume command. The discharge plan required 6 weeks without weight on the ankle, followed by physical therapy. Dad's house had narrow stairs, and the downstairs bathroom needed modifications. Preston offered their guest suite, which had a private bathroom and no steps. "It's temporary," he said. "He'll be home before Christmas." I suggested hiring home care at Dad's house instead. Vanessa stared at me. "You're going back to Boston on Monday. We are the people actually here." Dad, exhausted and medicated, said he would stay with them until he could walk safely. Before discharge, Preston produced a limited financial authorization allowing him to pay Dad's utilities, property taxes, insurance, and medical expenses while Dad recovered. I read it. It was narrow, time-limited, and automatically expired after 90 days. Dad signed it in front of a hospital notary. There was nothing alarming about the document. That mattered later because betrayal rarely begins with an obviously criminal page. It begins with a reasonable signature placed in the hands of someone who has already imagined what the next signature could buy. During the first 2 weeks, Dad answered my calls himself. He complained about Preston's weak coffee, Vanessa's decorative pillows, and the television in the guest room that required 3 remotes. His spirits were good. The surgical follow-up went well. Then the communication changed. Vanessa began answering his phone. "He's sleeping. He's in the shower." Physical therapy exhausted him. I asked her to have him call me back. Sometimes he did, usually hours later, with Vanessa moving around in the background. The conversations became short and strangely formal. When I asked whether he had seen his bank statements, he said Preston was handling everything. When I asked when he planned to return home, Vanessa answered from across the room. "The therapist says he isn't ready." I requested the therapist's name. She said she would send it, and never did. In December, I drove to Port Haven without warning. Dad was sitting near the window in Vanessa's living room with his ankle boot resting on an ottoman. He looked thinner but alert. I hugged him, then noticed that his wallet, keys, and phone were arranged on a shelf behind Vanessa's desk rather than beside him. "Dad, why is your phone over there?" Vanessa laughed. "Because he keeps dropping it." Dad's eyes moved toward her before he answered. "Your sister's running a tight ship." I recognized the tone. It was the same one patients used when they were trying to communicate without causing consequences after I left the room. I waited until Vanessa went to the grocery store and Preston drove to a job site. Then I sat beside Dad and asked one question. "Are you staying here because you want to?" He looked at the closed front door for several seconds. "I wanted to for the first few weeks. And now? Now every time I talk about going home, Preston tells me the insurance company could refuse coverage if I'm unsafe. That isn't how it works. I figured. He told me his mail had been redirected. Preston claimed porch theft made the house unsafe while it was empty. Dad had not seen a bank statement since November. His checkbook was locked in Preston's office because, according to Preston, scammers targeted older people after hospital stays. Dad had asked to visit his house twice. Both times, Vanessa said the weather was too bad. "Why didn't you tell me on the phone?" I asked. Because she sits close enough to hear me breathe. Before I could decide what to do, Vanessa returned. Dad immediately changed the subject. I wanted to remove him that day, but he refused. His ankle still required support, and he did not want the family exploding before Christmas. "Give me 2 more weeks," he said. "I'll walk out under my own power." I hated the decision, but he was competent and legally entitled to make it. I returned to Boston after arranging a private physical therapist to evaluate him at Vanessa's house. The therapist called the next morning to say Vanessa had canceled the visit because Dad was transitioning to a different care plan. Vanessa did not answer my calls for 2 days. When she finally did, she accused me of treating her home like a hospital unit. "You don't get to manage us from Boston," she said. "Dad needs consistency, not surprise professionals." I asked to speak with him. She said he was asleep. On December 23rd, Preston emailed me a photograph of Dad sitting in front of their Christmas tree, smiling and holding a mug. The subject line read, "Proof your father is alive and well." It was meant as sarcasm. Months later, that photograph would help prove exactly when they had stopped taking new pictures of him. Christmas was the last time I saw Dad at Vanessa's house. In January, she told me he had developed confusion after a urinary infection. She said the doctor advised limiting stressful calls. I requested medical records. Vanessa replied that Preston's authorization made him the primary contact and that they would update me when appropriate. I reminded her that the document covered bill payment, not health decisions. She stopped responding. Dad's phone went directly to voicemail. I contacted his primary care office, but the receptionist could only confirm that he had canceled an appointment. I called local hospitals, rehabilitation facilities, and the physical therapy practice. Nobody had him. I drove to Port Haven and found Vanessa's guest room empty. She stood in the doorway and told me Dad had gone to a coastal rehabilitation retreat. "Where?" "He asked us not to tell you because you make him anxious." Let me hear him say that. "You need to respect his boundaries." Preston appeared behind her and folded his arms. "This is becoming harassment, Claire." I called the police non-emergency number from my car. An officer visited the house. Vanessa told him Dad was safe in a licensed facility and had requested privacy. Because Dad had not been reported missing and there was no visible evidence of immediate danger, the officer documented the call and advised me to seek legal counsel. That was the day I learned how easily a family can convert secrecy into privacy by using the correct vocabulary. I returned to Boston, furious at myself for leaving. At work, I could locate a homeless patient's rehabilitation placement across 3 states, yet I could not find my own father. I searched every assisted living and rehabilitation facility in Maine under his full name. Nothing. I contacted the state long-term care ombudsman, who explained that without knowing the facility, investigation would be difficult. I filed a concern with Adult Protective Services. Vanessa responded by sending them photographs, medication lists, and a letter signed by a physician stating Dad required supervised living. The case remained open, but no one told me where he was. The breakthrough came from an automatic pharmacy alert. Years earlier, Dad had listed me as his emergency contact with a regional pharmacy chain. In February, I received a text stating that Samuel Mercer's blood pressure prescription was ready at a branch in New Hampshire, nearly 2 hours west of Port Haven. I called the store and identified myself. The pharmacist could not share private information, but when I asked whether the prescription had been transferred to support a residential facility, she hesitated and suggested I speak with my father's prescriber. The physician listed on the refill was not Dad's doctor. He was the medical director of Pine Hollow Memory Lodge in Dalton, New Hampshire. I was in my car within 10 minutes. Pine Hollow occupied a converted roadside inn behind a wooden sign painted with pine trees. The lobby contained artificial flowers, a locked reception desk, and a television showing a cooking program nobody watched. I introduced myself and asked for Samuel Mercer. The receptionist typed, frowned, and said there was no resident by that name. I repeated the spelling. She checked again. Then I noticed a folder on the counter labeled S. Vale. Vanessa's married name. "Try Samuel Vale," I said. The receptionist's face changed. 15 minutes later, after 3 staff members consulted one another, and I threatened to contact the state ombudsman from the lobby, a nurse escorted me down a hallway. Dad was in a small room at the far end, seated beside a window that looked onto a frozen parking lot. His ankle had healed. His hair was longer than I had ever seen it. He wore slippers 2 sizes too large and a sweater belonging to someone named Harold. But when he saw me, his whole posture straightened. "Claire," he said. "Tell me you didn't know." I knelt in front of him. "Know what?" "That they put me here." They had told him I arranged the placement. They said my hospital connections had found Pine Hollow and that I believed he was developing dementia. They told him I was too upset to speak with him until he accepted treatment. Meanwhile, they told me he wanted no contact. The strategy was brutally simple: give each of us a reason to believe the other had chosen the separation. Dad had arrived at Pine Hollow on January 9th. His chart described him as at risk of wandering and frequently resistant to memory care programming. There was no neurological evaluation confirming dementia. His admission paperwork had been signed by Preston under a durable power of attorney, dated January 3rd, nearly 3 weeks after the legitimate limited authorization had expired. Dad had never seen the second document. He had never used Vanessa's last name. The facility's records listed him as Samuel Vale because Preston claimed using Mercer triggered agitation after our mother's death. I asked Dad basic orientation questions out of habit. He gave me the date, location, president, tide schedule for Port Haven, and the exact mileage on his truck when he last drove it. Then he asked whether I planned to test his multiplication tables or help him leave. Pine Hollow's administrator initially insisted only Preston could authorize discharge. I asked whether the facility had a court order declaring Dad incapacitated. It did not. I asked whether a physician had certified that Dad lacked decision-making capacity. Nobody had. "Then he is a competent adult requesting discharge," I said. "Either process it or call your attorney while I call the state." Dad signed his own release 42 minutes later. He wrote slowly, clearly, and with the same unusual capital S he had used his entire life. A narrow first curve, followed by a long downward stroke. As we left, he stopped at reception and asked for a copy of every page containing his signature. The administrator refused, until I requested the refusal in writing. Suddenly, a copier became available. I took Dad to a hotel rather than directly home. We did not know whether Preston had access to the house, vehicles, or accounts. I bought him clothes, replaced his phone, and ordered room service chowder that he declared an insult to the coast. Then we began reading. The forged durable power of attorney granted Preston authority over all financial, medical, and real estate matters. It was notarized on January 3rd at 2:20 in the afternoon in Portland. Dad had spent that entire day at a follow-up appointment in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The clinic had checked him in at 12:58, performed imaging, administered a mild sedative for a painful manipulation of the ankle, and discharged him at 4:06. The two locations were more than 50 miles apart. More importantly, the notary had supposedly witnessed Dad's signature during the period when his medical chart documented him asleep under monitored sedation. The signature itself was wrong, too round, too careful, and missing the long descending line Dad always placed under his surname. But the date was better than handwriting. Dates do not become nervous under questioning. The next morning, Dad and I went to his bank. The account history showed $214,000 transferred over 12 weeks. Some payments were labeled medical care. Pine Hollow had received less than $18,000. Preston's development company had received $96,000 through 3 transfers. Another $51,000 had paid down a commercial loan secured by Vanessa and Preston's failing condominium project. Credit card payments, vehicle leases, and a $22,000 deposit to a kitchen contractor accounted for most of the rest. Dad had $31,400 remaining in liquid savings. Worse, Preston had submitted documents transferring the marina parcel into a new limited liability company called Vale Mercer Waterfront Holdings. The deed had not yet recorded because a title examiner questioned the notarization. An application was also pending to refinance Dad's house and marina together for $700,000. If approved, the money would rescue Preston's development long enough for him to sell it. "They didn't put me in that place because I was confused," Dad said. "They put me there because I could still say no." We hired attorney Evelyn Shaw, a 70-year-old elder law specialist whose office overlooked the harbor and contained no decorative object that did not also function as storage. She read the documents once, then again with a yellow pencil. "Your daughter and son-in-law have made several serious mistakes," she told Dad. "Their largest mistake was assuming you would remain unavailable." She prepared an immediate revocation of every power of attorney, served the banks and lenders, filed an identity and signature dispute, and placed alerts on the property titles. The refinancing froze. The deed transfer stopped. Adult Protective Services reopened the case with the Pine Hollow records attached. The bank's fraud department began tracing the transfers. Evelyn warned us that recovering the money would take time. Preston would claim Dad had verbally authorized investments in the family business. Vanessa would say every payment supported his care. The forged authority was powerful evidence, but intention could still be contested. "People like Preston rely on family confusion," Evelyn said. "They make each transaction sound temporary, informal, or misunderstood. Then they call anyone demanding records disloyal." Dad asked what would make the case undeniable. Evelyn tapped the copy of the durable power of attorney. Using forged documents to move money is one thing. Presenting another forged document publicly, while claiming personal knowledge of its validity, would be difficult to explain away. She did not recommend creating a trap. She simply answered the question. We found the next forged document 2 days later inside Dad's house. Evelyn arranged for a locksmith and a police standby because Preston had changed the locks. The house looked stripped of identity. Family photographs were stacked in boxes. Mom's jewelry cabinet was empty. Dad's workshop files had been opened. The brass fairy bell he had kept on the mantel was gone. It had been presented to him at retirement and engraved with the names of the maintenance crew. Vanessa had always hated it because Dad rang it during holiday dinners whenever people ignored him. We eventually found it wrapped in a blanket inside the garage, beside several items marked for estate appraisal. Dad carried it back into the house himself. On his desk, beneath a folder labeled Legacy Planning, we found a trust amendment dated April 2nd. It removed me entirely, appointed Vanessa and Preston as co-trustees, transferred the house, marina, investments, truck, and personal property to them, and included a statement declaring that Dad excluded me because I had abandoned family responsibilities. 2 witnesses had signed. One was Preston's office manager. The other was a subcontractor who owed Preston money. The document contained Dad's forged signature and a notary stamp from the same woman who had stamped the durable power of attorney. Dad stood at his desk, reading the sentence about abandonment. His face did not show anger at first. It showed injury. "They told me you had abandoned me," he said. "Now they wrote it down as though I said it about you." That night, Vanessa called my new number from a blocked line. Dad listened beside me. She claimed I had kidnapped him from specialized care and manipulated him into revoking necessary protections. Preston had already contacted an attorney about emergency guardianship. "Dad isn't safe with you," she said. "You work all day. We built our lives around him." I asked why he had been admitted under her last name. Silence. Then she said Pine Hollow must have made a clerical error. I asked why Preston's company had received $96,000. She began crying. "You have no idea what we sacrificed." "Whose money paid for the sacrifice?" Dad wanted to help us. I handed the phone to him. Vanessa did not know he was listening. "Then why didn't you ask me while I was awake?" he said. She stopped crying instantly. "Daddy, Claire is confusing you. What is my truck's license number?" She hesitated. "What?" "Claire knows it. I know it. You're telling a judge I can't remember my own life, so start with the truck." Vanessa changed tactics. She said Preston had made financial decisions without explaining them fully. She said she had trusted her husband. Dad asked whether she knew he was at Pine Hollow. "You needed care. Did you tell Claire where I was? You said you didn't want her involved. That is a lie." Vanessa's voice hardened. "You always choose her when she shows up. I'm the one who stayed through everything," Dad answered quietly. "Staying close enough to take my keys is not the same as standing beside me." She hung up. Preston filed for emergency guardianship the next morning. His petition described Dad as disoriented, impulsive, financially vulnerable, and controlled by an estranged daughter. Evelyn responded with an independent capacity evaluation from a geriatric psychiatrist. Dad scored exceptionally well. The doctor described him as fully capable of managing personal and financial decisions. The petition would likely fail, but the hearing was 3 weeks away. Preston needed those weeks. His construction lender had issued a default notice. Without Dad's refinance, Preston risked foreclosure and personal bankruptcy. He began calling Dad's friends and telling them Claire had isolated a confused old man for money. Vanessa posted a message online asking for prayers during a painful elder care crisis. People who had known us for decades began choosing sides based on whichever version reached them first. Dad read every comment without responding. Then he asked me to call Arthur Bell. Arthur had captained ferries with Dad for 26 years and later became chairman of the Port Haven Maritime Hall, an old terminal converted into a community center and museum. He had performed memorials for retired sailors and Coast Guard families for decades. He possessed a solemn voice, a broad white beard, and a reputation so dependable that people trusted him with keys, boats, and bad news. Dad explained what he wanted. Arthur listened with both hands resting on the brass head of his cane. When Dad finished, Arthur said, "This is either brilliant or the reason our wives were correct about us." Mom had been gone 4 years. Arthur's wife had died the previous spring. Dad replied, "They can discuss it while we're busy." The plan did not involve a false death certificate, insurance claim, police report, newspaper obituary, or official record. Arthur would call Vanessa personally and say Dad had collapsed during an early morning visit to the marina and had not survived. He would tell her that Dad's old ferry crew wanted to organize a private celebration of life at the Maritime Hall before any formal arrangements. Pine Hollow, if contacted, could truthfully say Samuel was no longer a resident. Evelyn would not participate in the deception. She agreed only to attend the gathering if Vanessa announced estate matters or presented documents. A bank investigator and county detective already reviewing the fraud would be notified that Vanessa and Preston might publicly rely on the disputed trust amendment. They would decide what to do with that information. Dad's purpose was not merely to catch Preston. He wanted to hear what his daughter did when she believed he could no longer contradict her. "A person's grief tells you who they lost," he said. "I need to know whether Vanessa lost a father or an obstacle." I argued against it for an hour. I worried Preston would use the event to strengthen the guardianship petition or claim Dad was unstable. Dad answered that people already called him unstable while forging his name. "I spent months inside a locked building because everyone trusted their paperwork more than my voice," he said. "I want my voice back in the same room where they used the paper." Arthur called Vanessa on Monday evening. Dad and I listened from the other side of the room. Arthur told her Samuel had collapsed near the marina workshop and was gone. Vanessa made a sound that might have become a sob if she had allowed it time. Instead, she asked, "Was he alone?" Arthur said no. She asked where his belongings were. Arthur said he had not checked. Vanessa asked whether Dad had been carrying a folder or keys, not where the body had gone, not whether he suffered, not whether someone had held his hand. Keys and paperwork. Arthur explained that the Maritime Hall would host a celebration on Thursday afternoon. Vanessa said she and Preston needed time during the service to address Dad's estate plan because certain family members might create confusion. Arthur agreed. 11 minutes after the call ended, the title company handling the waterfront transfer received a voicemail from Preston claiming Samuel Mercer had died and requesting urgent instructions for completing a pre-death conveyance. 34 minutes later, Preston emailed the bank a copy of the forged trust amendment and asked whether successor trustees could access funds immediately. The bank investigator preserved both messages. The next morning, Vanessa called me. Dad sat at my kitchen table, the recovered ferry bell beside him. "Claire," she said, "Dad passed yesterday." I made my voice unsteady. "What happened?" His heart. It was quick. She had invented details Arthur never gave her. "Were you with him?" I asked. Preston and I had seen him shortly before. He knew we were there for him. Dad looked at me without blinking. Vanessa continued. "You should prepare yourself. Dad finalized his trust weeks ago. He left everything to us because we handled his care. There's language explaining why you were excluded." Preston spoke near the phone. "Tell her the locks have been changed and she is not authorized to remove anything." Vanessa added, "Please don't arrive with lawyers and create a scene. For once, show some respect." Dad reached toward the phone. I muted the call. He leaned close and said the 6 words I had waited to hear. Let her inherit the truth in public. Then he sat back and picked up his coffee. I told Vanessa I would attend the celebration. By noon, she had posted a tribute describing herself as the daughter who had remained beside Dad through his final season. The photograph attached was the same image Preston had emailed me before Christmas. Dad holding a mug beside their tree. The tree had been cropped out, and the image had been converted to black and white. That was when I understood every proof-of-life photograph Vanessa had sent after December had come from the same afternoon. Same sweater, same chair, same light through the window. She had created months of updates from a single collection of photographs taken before Dad entered Pine Hollow. On Wednesday, a locksmith arrived at Dad's house on Vanessa's instructions and installed a keypad. A moving company delivered appraisal boxes. Preston requested estimates for clearing the workshop and selling the marina equipment. They did not wait for a funeral because grief was never the schedule they were following. Dad spent Wednesday evening ironing his dark suit and polishing the brass ferry bell. I wore this suit to your mother's memorial, he said. I never expected to wear it to mine. On Thursday, the Port Haven Maritime Hall filled beyond capacity. Former ferry workers arrived in navy jackets. Marina tenants came in work boots. Neighbors, church members, town officials, nurses from Dad's doctor's office, and people who had known our family for 40 years occupied every folding chair. Arthur placed a large photograph of Dad beside a table holding his old engineer's cap, a lantern, and white roses. There was no casket. Arthur announced that arrangements remained private. Vanessa arrived in black with Preston beside her, carrying a leather portfolio. She greeted people at the entrance as though she had organized the room. Preston accepted condolences with one hand while typing messages with the other. They took the 2 chairs closest to the podium. I sat halfway back. Evelyn occupied a side table near the wall, reading the program with her briefcase beneath her chair. Dad waited in the old ticket office behind the stage, accessible through a narrow door that opened beside the maritime exhibits. At 3 o'clock, Arthur spoke about Dad's years on the ferries, his stubbornness, and his habit of ringing the brass bell whenever a meeting became too long. People laughed. Then Arthur invited the family to share a few words. Vanessa approached first. She cried convincingly while describing Dad as private, proud, and increasingly dependent during his final months. She said she and Preston had made difficult sacrifices to honor his wishes. Then she looked toward me. Not everyone understood what he needed, she said. Some people visited when convenient and judged those who carried the daily burden. She introduced Preston as the person Dad had trusted with his final decisions. Preston placed the leather portfolio on the podium. He thanked everyone for supporting the family and said Samuel wanted transparency. In April, while fully aware of his circumstances, Sam amended his trust, he said. He transferred the Maple Ridge residence, the marina parcel, his financial accounts, vehicles, equipment, and personal property to Vanessa and me. He did this because we remained present while Claire chose a life elsewhere. The room became uncomfortable rather than sympathetic. Dad's friends knew he had spoken proudly of my hospital work. Preston continued because silence has never warned confident men as clearly as it should. He removed the trust amendment and held it up. Samuel specifically excluded Claire for abandonment and financial manipulation. We did not intend to discuss this today, but her recent conduct makes clarity necessary. He read the paragraph aloud. Each word echoed through the terminal our father had crossed thousands of times. Then Preston signed a statement attached to the document affirming that he had personally witnessed Dad review and approve the amendment. The bank investigator, seated behind Evelyn, watched him place his initials beside the date. Arthur stepped toward the microphone. You are certain Samuel signed that page on April 2nd? Preston replied. I was present. And he understood every word? Completely. Arthur looked toward the old ticket office door. Then perhaps he can explain it better than you. The door opened. Dad walked into his own memorial carrying the brass ferry bell by its handle. He wore his dark suit, engineer's pin, and the expression he used when inspecting machinery someone had claimed was repaired. Nobody moved at first. Then a woman near the front gasped his name. A former captain stood so quickly his chair fell backwards. Someone began crying. Arthur stepped aside. Dad reached the podium, placed the bell beside the forged amendment, and rang it once. The sound rolled through the old terminal, bright and unmistakable. Vanessa gripped the back of her chair. Preston remained at the microphone with his mouth open. Dad looked at the photograph, then at the roses. "Good picture," he said, "taken 3 months before my final season apparently began." A nervous laugh moved through the room. Dad turned to Preston. "You just told everyone you watched me sign that paper on April 2nd. Preston found his voice. "Samuel, this is evidence of exactly what we've been saying. Claire has manipulated you into some kind of stunt. Where did I sign it?" "At your house." "Which room?" "Your office." "What was I wearing?" Preston stared. Dad pushed the document toward him. "You remember me understanding every word, but not the room around us?" Vanessa stood. "Daddy, please, we thought you were dead." Dad looked at her. "You were told I collapsed. You never asked where I was. You asked where my keys were." She turned toward Arthur. "He lied to us." "Yes," Dad said. "And you used the lie to tell the truth about yourselves." Preston raised his voice. "This is entrapment." Evelyn stood. "No one instructed you to contact the title company, submit a disputed document to the bank, or sign a witness declaration that you personally observed its execution." She walked to the front carrying a thin stack of records. "You made those decisions independently." Dad opened the folder Claire had carried and laid his real records beside the forged amendment. Evelyn explained each one without drama. The legitimate 90-day financial authorization from November expired. The durable power of attorney Preston filed in January, allegedly signed while Dad's hospital record documented him under sedation 50 miles away. The Pine Hollow admission papers using a false surname. The independent capacity evaluation confirming Dad was competent. The bank statements showing $214,000 transferred. The title examiner's hold on the marina deed. The frozen $700,000 refinance. Then Evelyn displayed Dad's verified signatures from 30 years of ferry records. Every one contained the long downward stroke beneath Mercer. Neither forged document did. Preston attempted to interrupt. Dad rang the bell again. "You have spoken for me long enough." The room went silent. He faced Vanessa. "I want to hear one answer from you, not from your husband. Did you know where I was?" Tears gathered in her eyes. "We were trying to protect you." "Did you know I was in Pine Hollow?" "Yes." "Did you tell Claire?" "You said you didn't want her interfering." "I never said that." "You were angry and confused." "Did you tell me Claire arranged the placement?" Vanessa's face collapsed slightly. "Preston said it would help you cooperate." "Did you use the same Christmas photograph for every update after January?" She looked at the floor. People kept asking questions. Questions are what families ask when you hide a man. Preston grabbed the forged amendment from the podium. "We are done here." He stepped away and found 2 investigators standing near the aisle. One identified himself as a detective assigned to the Elder Financial Exploitation complaint. The other represented the bank's fraud division. The detective asked Preston to leave the document on the table. Preston said this was a private family matter. The investigator replied that forged authority, attempted real estate transfer, and disputed bank transactions were no longer private. Vanessa reached for Dad. He stepped back. It was a small movement, but she reacted as though he had closed a door. "Daddy, we were drowning," she said. "The project failed. The lender was calling every day. Preston said we could replace the money after the unit sold. So you put me in memory care. You kept refusing to help. Because it was my money. You helped Claire with college. You helped her move to Boston. You never gave me anything equal." Dad's expression softened, which hurt her more than anger would have. "I paid for your wedding. I guaranteed your first business lease. I covered your mortgage for 8 months after Preston's first development failed. You called every rescue unequal because it ended before you felt secure." Vanessa looked toward me. "You always get to be the good daughter." I stood and answered calmly. "You called me this morning to tell me I had been erased before you asked how Dad died." She shook her head. "You wanted this. You wanted everyone watching." "No. Dad wanted everyone who heard your lies to hear his voice." Preston tried to leave through the side aisle. The detective stopped him and requested that he accompany them for an interview. He was not handcuffed. He was simply separated from the room he could no longer control. As he passed Dad, Preston said. "I was going to return everything," Dad replied. "You were trying to borrow $700,000 against my home after spending the first $214,000. That is not repayment. That is appetite." Preston looked toward Vanessa, expecting her to defend him. She sat down instead. Dad returned to the microphone. He did not deliver a long speech. He looked at the former ferry workers, neighbors, and people who had believed competing versions of his life. "I am not dead," he said. "I am not confused. And I did not give anyone permission to hide me, rename me, spend my savings, mortgage my home, or tell one daughter that the other abandoned me." Then he lifted the brass bell. "This bell was given to me by people who trusted me to keep machinery running and bring them home through bad weather. I should have guarded my own papers with the same care. Learn from that before your family has to learn it in a room like this." He rang the bell once more and stepped away. The gathering ended without music. People approached Dad carefully, as though he had returned from somewhere farther away than New Hampshire. Arthur embraced him and said it was the first memorial where the guest of honor had complained about the flowers. Dad replied that the coffee was the greater offense. Vanessa remained in the front row until most people left. When she finally stood, she approached Dad alone. Preston was already speaking with investigators in another room. "Do you hate me?" she asked. Dad took time before answering. "No, but I do not trust you, and love does not erase that sentence." She cried silently. "What happens now? Now you tell the truth without Preston writing it for you." The criminal and civil cases lasted 10 months. Preston was charged with forgery, exploitation of an older adult, attempted theft by deception, falsifying real estate documents, and fraud connected to the refinancing application. His development company entered bankruptcy. The bank recovered part of the money from accounts frozen before he could move it. Equipment and a luxury vehicle purchased through the company were sold. Dad ultimately recovered $162,000 of the $214,000 taken. The remaining loss hurt, but the house and marina were protected. The forged deed never recorded, and the refinance never funded. The notary who stamped the documents lost her commission and cooperated with investigators. Preston's office manager admitted she had witnessed blank signature pages and accepted a plea agreement. Vanessa avoided prison by pleading guilty to conspiracy and financial exploitation, providing records, and agreeing to restitution. The judge sentenced her to supervised probation, community service, and mandatory counseling. Dad requested that part of her service take place with an elder advocacy organization, not because he thought humiliation would reform her, but because he wanted her to sit with people whose families had used the same excuses she had used. Dad moved back into his Maple Ridge house. The first thing he did was reinstall the brass bell beside the kitchen doorway. The second was replace every lock, password, account number, and authorization. Evelyn created a revocable living trust with clear safeguards, independent oversight, and equal access to records for Dad and me. Dad chose me as successor trustee, but only after insisting that a professional fiduciary serve jointly so no child would ever hold unchecked power again. "Trust people," he said, signing the documents. "Just don't make trust allergic to receipts." I reduced my hospital schedule and began spending 3 days each week in Port Haven. Dad refused to let me move into his house because he said recovering independence did not require acquiring a 38-year-old roommate. We established routines instead. I visited every Sunday. Arthur checked the marina on Tuesdays. Dad's physician sent records directly to him. Every account statement arrived in paper and electronic form. Presents stopped being something either daughter could use as proof of ownership. Vanessa and I did not speak for 6 months. Then she mailed me a letter without excuses. She wrote that resentment had made every act of care feel like unpaid labor and every dollar Dad spent elsewhere feel stolen from her. Preston had amplified that resentment, but she admitted he had not invented it. She had agreed to hide Dad's location. She had repeated lies about me. She had watched money leave his accounts and chosen not to ask questions because the money was solving problems she wanted solved. The letter did not ask forgiveness. It enclosed the first restitution payment. Dad met her eventually in Evelyn's office. Not at home. He told her reconciliation would be measured in consistent truth, not emotional promises. "You do not get keys because you cry," he said. You earn conversation by keeping the next agreement. She accepted the condition. Their relationship remains limited. They speak once a month. She has never again entered his house without invitation. Preston received a prison sentence after pleading guilty to several charges. He sent Dad a letter claiming he had been driven by desperation rather than greed. Dad returned it unopened with a note written on the envelope. Desperation asks. Greed signs another man's name. The Maritime Hall never stopped talking about the memorial. Arthur began hosting quarterly workshops called Before the Bell Rings, where attorneys, bank officers, physicians, and social workers taught families how powers of attorney worked, how to review account access, how to recognize isolation, and how to document capacity. Dad attended every session and placed the brass bell on the table. Whenever someone said they trusted their children and did not need safeguards, he answered, "Safeguards are not accusations. They are instructions for the day love gets tired, frightened, or expensive." The first workshop drew 19 people. By the fourth, the hall was full. A woman from Bangor discovered that her nephew had redirected her mail. A retired fisherman learned someone had added themselves to his account. 2 families changed documents before anyone lost a home. Dad said those outcomes made the missing $52,000 feel like tuition. A year after the memorial, we held a real gathering at the Maritime Hall for Dad's 77th birthday. No black clothes, no forged papers, and no photograph pretending to be a body. Arthur placed the same white roses on the table because he had already paid for the vases. Dad rang the bell before cutting the cake and announced, "I appreciate everyone attending an event where my continued breathing is not a surprise." The room laughed. Vanessa attended alone and sat near the back. She did not approach the microphone. She carried food trays, collected plates, and left after asking Dad whether he needed anything. It was the first useful question she had asked without assuming the answer. People often ask whether staging the memorial was revenge. In some ways it was. Dad wanted Vanessa and Preston to experience the public collapse of the story they had built around him, but the real revenge was not the shock on their faces when he entered. It was everything that followed. He returned to his home. He recovered most of his savings. He took control of his name, health, money, and voice. He created protections that would outlive another emergency. And he used the humiliation intended for him to protect strangers. Preston believed power came from possessing the right document. Vanessa believed love could be measured by who remained geographically closest. I believed competence would protect the people I loved even when I was not present. All 3 beliefs failed. A signature is not consent when someone is hidden from information. Proximity is not devotion when it depends on control. And professional knowledge means little if fear keeps you from acting decisively inside your own family. The morning Vanessa called to say Dad was dead, he sat across from me eating eggs from the pan. She believed death had made him silent enough to inherit. She did not understand that his silence had already ended. 3 days later, when he carried that brass bell into his own memorial and watched Preston hold up a document signed by a supposedly dead man, Dad gave my sister the only inheritance she had actually earned: the truth, delivered publicly and impossible to return. The sentence he had spoken into the muted phone was exactly right. She inherited the truth in front of everyone. And unlike the house, the marina, or the money she tried to claim, it was the one thing nobody could transfer back.